I will tell you about the 3 worst years of my grandmother's life, and the one decision she made that saved mine. She would not call it a scheme. If you used that word in her presence, and I did once on a Tuesday evening in late October when the candles had burned low and the brandy had been poured twice, she set down her embroidery, looked at me over the tops of her spectacles, and said, "Edmund, a scheme implies deception. I simply arranged furniture." Then she picked up the embroidery again, and that was the end of it. She was, of course, lying. But she was 81 years old and had buried a husband, 3 siblings, and 1 grandson, and I had decided long before that Tuesday evening that she had more than earned the right to lie about whatever she pleased. My name is Edmund Radcliffe. I am the 6th Duke of Ashfern, and for 3 consecutive London seasons I refused every woman my grandmother placed before me. I was not cruel about it. I was, I am told, worse than cruel. I was polite. A cold, thorough, impenetrable politeness that left no room for argument and no wound for anger to attach itself to. The daughters of earls and the nieces of viscounts departed our drawing room with their dignity entirely intact, and their hopes entirely extinguished, and I went back to my correspondence and did not think of them again. My grandmother endured this for 3 years. Then, without telling me what she was doing, she hired a companion. Her name was Corinna Vale. I did not notice her at first. That is not quite true. I noticed her the way you notice a well-placed piece of furniture, something that belongs so completely in its setting that the eye moves past it without catching. She was always at the edge of the room, pouring tea, locating a misplaced letter, steadying my grandmother's embroidery frame when the old woman's hands grew uncertain. She spoke when spoken to and was quiet when not, which in a London drawing room full of people performing their own importance was, I would later understand, a form of extraordinary discipline. She was a rector's daughter from somewhere in Gloucestershire. She had come to my grandmother through the recommendation of a bishop whose name I have now forgotten, and she had been in the household for approximately 6 weeks before I learned her surname. I am not proud of this. I tell it because it is true, and because if I am going to explain how my grandmother outmaneuvered me, a man who had run an estate of 12,000 acres since the age of 22, who had sat in parliamentary committees and overseen legal negotiations of considerable complexity, then I owe it to the record to admit that she did so by exploiting a blindness I did not know I had. The first season had been Lady Philippa Ashworth. She was 20, exceptionally handsome, and had a laugh that filled a room. My grandmother had presented her at a dinner in March, and I had sat beside her for 4 courses and found her perfectly agreeable and felt absolutely nothing. And in the carriage on the way home my grandmother had said, "Well," and I had said, "She will make someone an excellent wife," and my grandmother had closed her eyes and breathed through her nose for a long moment before saying, "Yes, I expect she will." The second season brought 3 candidates in rapid succession, as though my grandmother had decided that volume might succeed where precision had failed. There was Miss Dorothea Pine, who was clever and sharp-tongued and argued with me about the Corn Laws at a soiree and was entirely right, which I respected enormously. There was Miss Araminta Forsyth, who played the pianoforte so beautifully that the whole room held its breath, and when the last note fell she turned and looked at me with such naked hope that I felt something very close to shame. And there was Lady Caroline Voss, who was 27 and had already survived 1 disastrous engagement, and had about her the particular self-possession of a woman who had been disappointed and decided it would not break her. I admired Lady Caroline Voss more than any of them. I still refused. My grandmother did not shout. She never shouted. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with white hair that she wore in an old-fashioned style and hands that had grown gnarled at the knuckles, but were still surprisingly strong when she gripped your arm to make a point. Her weapon was silence, the specific, weighted silence of a woman who had decided that speaking would be wasted energy, and that waiting was more effective than any argument. She deployed this silence on me on the evening of the third refusal, in the sitting room of Ashburn House, and it lasted for approximately 11 minutes before she simply said, "Go to bed, Edmund," and I did. The third season she tried Miss Harriet Lowe, who was sweet and gentle and frightened of horses, and a Miss Evangeline Marsh, who was not frightened of anything and told me so with considerable frequency, and a lady whose name I will not write here because she is now happily married to someone far better suited to her, and I will not intrude on her good fortune even in retrospect. Each of them went the same way. Each refusal was delivered with the same careful courtesy. My grandmother sat through each one, and her silences grew longer, and her embroidery grew more intricate, and Coroner Vale moved quietly at the edges of every gathering, keeping the household running, and I did not look at her. I should tell you about my brother. His name was Nicholas. He was 4 years younger than I, and he was everything I was not, easy where I was severe, warm where I was contained, inclined to laugh in exactly the moments when I was most inclined to frown. He had gone to sea at 19 against my advice, and against my grandmother's, because Nicholas always did exactly what he wanted with a cheerfulness that made it impossible to remain angry at him. And for 2 years he had written letters from ports I could barely locate on a map, and the letters had been full of light and strangeness, and the particular joy of a young man discovering that the world was larger than he had imagined. The letters stopped when he was 21. The ship was called the Margrave. There was a storm off the coast of Portugal in November, and Nicholas Radcliffe was not among the men recovered. I was 25. I became the Duke of Ashburn that same year, when my father followed him into the ground 6 months later. Grief, the physician said, though I have always thought they were being professionally tactful about a man who simply stopped bothering to live once his favorite son was gone. And I ran the estate, and I sat in the committees, and I was, by every external measure, exactly what a Duke of Ashburn was required to be, and I did not allow myself to think too carefully about what it had cost me to become it. I do not tell you this so that you will be sorry for me. I tell you because it is what Coroner Vale understood before I understood it myself, and without that understanding none of the rest of this makes any sense. She figured it out on a Wednesday in late June, during the third season, at a dinner party my grandmother had arranged with what I now recognize was considerable strategic cunning. There were 8 of us at the table. I was seated by the hand of my grandmother, though it was done so naturally that I did not question it at the time, beside Coroner, who was there not as a guest precisely but as my grandmother's companion, present in the way that useful people are present, seen but not particularly counted. The dinner conversation turned, as London dinner conversations will, to matters of general interest, and then to the Navy, and then by a route I could not have predicted to the loss of a ship called the Margrave, which had lately been the subject of some parliamentary inquiry. I heard the name and I did not flinch. I had trained myself over 8 years not to flinch, but something must have shifted in my face, because I felt rather than saw the woman beside me become very still. She did not look at me, she did not ask me anything. She simply, after a moment, asked the gentleman across the table a question about the current state of the Naval Appropriations Bill, which redirected the conversation entirely, and by the time the fish course was removed, we were talking about something else altogether. I looked at her then. She was not looking at me. She was listening to the gentleman across the table with an expression of genuine attention, and there was nothing in her manner that suggested she had done anything remarkable or expected anything in return. She was dressed plainly, a companion's dress, good fabric but no ornamentation, and her hair was arranged neatly and without particular effort to impress. She was not young in the way that the daughters of earls presented to me were young. She was perhaps 28, with the kind of face that settles into itself rather than performing, and there were faint lines at the corners of her eyes that suggested she had spent a significant portion of her life amused by things she had decided not to comment on. She was, I thought, entirely unremarkable. I spent the rest of the dinner watching her without meaning to. After the gentlemen rejoined the ladies, I found myself near the window, and she was near the window, and for a moment we were briefly alone in the way that two people at the edge of a party are briefly alone, with the noise of everyone else carrying on at a polite distance. She did not speak first, I did. "Thank you," I said, "for this evening, the conversation." She looked at me without any particular surprise or gratification. "The Naval Appropriations Bill is genuinely interesting," she said. "I was not purely diverting attention." "I know," I said. "That was partly why I thanked you." She looked at me for a moment, the look of a person reassessing something, and then she said, "I am sorry about your brother," and went back to join my grandmother, and I stood at the window for what must have been several minutes before I realized that the room had shifted somehow, and I could not quite account for what had changed. My grandmother, I noticed, was watching me from across the room with an expression of profound, carefully disguised satisfaction. I did not connect this to anything, not then. July brought the household to Ashford, the estate in Wiltshire, 4,000 acres of chalk downland and beechwood, a house that had been in the family since the reign of Queen Anne, and the particular quality of silence that only old houses achieve. Not absence of sound, but depth of it, as though the walls have absorbed 2 centuries of living and breathe it back at intervals. My grandmother came every summer, and she brought Corinna Vale, and I told myself this was simply the ordinary fact of a household in movement. The first thing I noticed, the first thing I allowed myself to notice, was that she walked in the early morning. Not to be seen walking, not as a performance of healthful habits for the benefit of anyone watching, but because she appeared to genuinely prefer the grounds before the rest of the household was awake. I discovered this because I also walked in the early morning, had done for years, as a way of beginning the day before it could ambush me with its requirements. I came around the corner of the kitchen garden wall one morning in mid-July and nearly ran into her. She was carrying a small bunch of lavender she had cut from the border, and she had a book tucked under her arm, and she looked at me with the expression of a person who has been discovered doing something entirely innocent, and is nonetheless briefly startled. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Vale," I said. We stood there for a moment in the early light, which was very clean and very gold, and had the quality of light that has not yet been used by anyone. "I have not been raiding the kitchen garden," she said. "The lavender is from the far border, which Mrs. Ashcroft told me is considered the companion's lavender and may be cut freely." "I had not supposed you were raiding anything," I said. "Your expression suggested a territorial interest in the lavender." "My expression," I said, "is simply my expression. I am told it frequently implies things I do not intend." She considered this. "That must be exhausting," she said, with no particular cruelty, as though it were simply an observation about a state of affairs she had noted and filed away. Then she said, "I will let you have the path," and moved aside, and I walked past her, and I was approximately 40 yards away before I registered that I was smiling. I stopped walking. I considered the smile. I was not certain what to do with it, so I filed it away in the same manner she appeared to file things, and continued toward the east field. The rainstorm came in the 3rd week of July. This is the element of the story that my grandmother, if she were telling it, would mention with the most innocent expression she possessed, which was a very innocent expression indeed. I have never been able to establish, to my complete satisfaction, whether she arranged the rainstorm. I believe she arranged the placement. I believe she knew the library roof leaked over the south window and had not mentioned it. I believe she knew that Corinna went to the library on Wednesday afternoons, and that I went there on Wednesday afternoons to review correspondence. And I believe she arranged our respective Wednesdays so that there was no conceivable reason for either of us to leave once the rain started, because the covered route back to the main house required passing through the gallery, and the gallery roof was substantially worse. What I know for certain is that the rain came hard and fast at 2:30, and Corina Vale and I were both in the library, and by the time either of us had registered the downpour, the windows were sheeting white and going anywhere was obviously unreasonable, and so we stayed. She was reading. I was pretending to review correspondence while being aware of her reading. After perhaps 10 minutes, during which the only sound was the rain and the occasional turn of a page, she said, without looking up, "You may ask what I am reading. People generally do when they run out of other conversational approaches." I had not intended to make conversation, I said. "No, but you have been looking at your correspondence without turning a page for approximately 9 minutes, which suggests you are finding it less absorbing than you hoped." I set the correspondence down. "What are you reading?" She held up the book. It was a natural history, a very old one with a battered spine, on the subject of chalk downland flora and their medicinal uses. "Is that from this library?" I said. "Yes, the Ashburn collection is extraordinary. Your grandfather appears to have had a genuine interest in botany." He did. He also had a genuine interest in navigation, astronomical observation, and the cultivation of pears, so the collection is somewhat varied. "Enthusiastic minds often are," she said. Then, after a pause, "Was your brother like him?" The question landed very quietly. She had not leaned forward to ask it. She had not softened her voice into the careful register that people adopt when they approach the subject of loss, as though grief is a sleeping animal that might wake suddenly. She had simply asked it, the way she asked everything, directly and without ceremony, and the directness of it meant there was no performance required in return. "In some ways," I said, "Nicholas was interested in everything. The world was to him a collection of things that had not yet been examined closely enough." "That sounds like a gift," she said. "It was," I said. "It was also what took him to sea." She nodded. She did not say anything about Providence, or God's will, or the particular consolations that people reach for when they do not know what else to offer. She simply said, "I imagine it is a complicated grief, missing the person and missing the version of yourself that existed before." I looked at her for a moment. "Yes," I said, "that is precisely it." The rain continued for another hour. We talked about the chalk downland book, and then about Gloucestershire, where she had grown up, and then about the particular problem of very old houses with leaking roofs, and then about nothing in particular, which is to say about everything, in the way that two people talk when they have stopped performing and started simply being in a room together. When the rain stopped and the light returned, golden and clarified, she stood and closed the book and said, "Thank you for the company, Your Grace," and went back toward the house. I sat in the library for another quarter of an hour, doing nothing at all. My grandmother was in the west sitting room when I found her, embroidering with the concentration of a general surveying completed terrain. She looked up as I came in, and her expression was so thoroughly neutral that it was almost offensive. "Good afternoon, Edmund," she said. "The gallery roof needs attention," I said. "Does it?" she said. "You knew that." "I know a great many things about this house," she said. "I have been coming here for 53 years. I looked at her, she looked at me. The embroidery needle moved. "She is your companion," I said. "She is," my grandmother agreed. "She is not a candidate." "I presented no one this season," my grandmother said, with absolute accuracy and complete dishonesty. "I have been very restrained. Everyone has remarked upon it." I left the room before I said something I would have to apologize for. The evenings at Ashburn in summer were long and very quiet. After dinner my grandmother generally retired by 9, and the household settled, and I had fallen into the habit of working in the study until late. I did not examine this habit too closely. I will tell you now that I was aware, in the unacknowledged way that one is aware of things one has decided not to look at directly, that Corina Vale also stayed up late, that there was a light, visible from the study window in the east sitting room, which was where she read in the evenings. I did not go to the east sitting room. Then, on a Thursday in late July, I needed a copy of a letter that I believed had been misfiled, and that my grandmother's organizational system, which was elaborate, personal, and almost entirely opaque to anyone else, had probably consumed. I went to ask after it and found Corina at the east sitting room table with a lamp and several letters spread before her, working through my grandmother's filing with the careful attention of someone who has learned to treat chaos as a puzzle rather than an affront. She looked up. "Good evening, Your Grace. Are you looking for the Milverton correspondence?" "I am," I said with some surprise. "Third folder from the left in the upper drawer," she said. "I refiled it last week. Your grandmother had it under M for Milverton but also under E for Edmund, which is how it got separated." I found the correspondence. I should have said thank you and left. Instead, I stood at the desk for a moment and then said, "How long have you been making sense of her filing system?" "Since approximately my third day," she said. "It is a very good system, actually. It simply requires understanding that your grandmother's logic is thematic rather than alphabetical. Once you grasp the themes, everything follows." "What are the themes?" She considered. People she trusts, people she is watching, things that require action, things that are finished, things that are important but that she intends to ignore until they become urgent. She paused. "You are in people she trusts, if that is useful information." "Where are you?" She looked at me with an expression I could not quite name. "I do not file my own correspondence," she said. "That would be presumptuous." I sat down, which I had not planned to do. "She trusts very few people," I said. "She is a good judge of character, and her judgment trends skeptical." "I know," Corina said. "I take it as a considerable compliment." She set down the letter she was holding. "You should probably know, Your Grace, that I am aware of what she has been doing this summer." I went very still. "I am not a fool," she said, with no heat, no accusation, simply the matter-of-fact tone of someone correcting an error in a ledger. "She has been placing me in your way since July began. The morning garden path, the library Wednesday, the dinner arrangement in June in London. I should have recognized it earlier, but I will confess that it did not occur to me for some time because," she paused, "because it seemed implausible." "Why implausible?" She looked at me directly. Her eyes, in the lamplight, were a clear, quiet gray. "Because I am your grandmother's companion," she said. "I am a rector's daughter with no fortune and no connections and no particular claim on anyone's notice. I have been a companion for 4 years, which is, in certain drawing rooms, a polite word for a woman who has already concluded that the part of life that includes hoping for things of that kind is probably behind her." She said this without self-pity, as one states a fact about geography. "The scheme, your grandmother's scheme, is very kind. But it is also, respectfully, absurd, and I think it would be better for everyone if we simply acknowledged it and I carried on as I was." I looked at her across the table with its spread of letters and its lamp. "Is it absurd?" I said. She looked at me with an expression of absolute caution, as though she was examining a statement for traps. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Tell me why." "I have just told you why." "You told me why it would be implausible for me to want it," I said. "That is not the same thing." The lamp moved slightly in a draft from the window. Outside, the Wiltshire night was very dark and very still, and I could hear, distantly, an owl somewhere in the beechwood. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are being kind. Because your grandmother asked you to be kind, or because you are a kind man who has simply learned to keep it hidden. And I think—" She stopped. "What do you think?" "I think it would be very easy to mistake kindness for something else," she said, "and I think that mistake would be difficult to make and then to unwind." She looked at her hands. "I have made it before. I would rather not make it again." Something in this, the directness of it, the cost it had taken her to say it, reached me in a way that the 3 years of presented candidates had not. They had all been performing. She was not performing. She was simply telling me the truth about what it cost her to have hope, and asking me not to waste it. "I am not being kind," I said. "Or I am, but that is not the whole of it, and I will not pretend it is." She was quiet. "I have sat next to a great many women in the last 3 years," I said. "My grandmother has been extremely thorough. Some of them were very accomplished. Some of them were very intelligent. One of them was right about the corn laws in a way I found genuinely impressive. And I sat beside all of them and felt nothing that I recognized as a reason to do what I was being asked to do." I looked across the table. "You redirected a dinner table conversation to spare me a difficulty you had no reason to notice and no obligation to address," I said. "You asked me about Nicholas as though his life mattered more than his death, which is something almost no one does. You identified my grandmother's filing system's organizational principle within 3 days. You have been telling me, for the last several minutes, a true thing about yourself that was clearly not easy to say, and you said it plainly, without asking me to manage your feelings about saying it." I paused. "I notice you. I have been noticing you since June and telling myself it was irrelevant." She looked at me. "That is," she said, after a moment, "quite a different thing from what I expected you to say." "What did you expect?" "Something reassuring and general," she said. "Something that could have been said to anyone." "It couldn't have been," I said. "It was specifically about you." The lamp between us was steady now. She was looking at me with the expression of someone who is attempting to determine whether a piece of ground will hold their weight before committing to step onto it. "I don't know what to do with this," she said finally. "You don't have to do anything with it tonight," I said. "I simply wanted you to have it accurately, rather than as a misunderstanding." She nodded very slowly. Then she said, "Your grandmother is not subtle." "No," I said, "but she is on balance right more often than not." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but the preliminary structure of one, the thing that comes before a smile decides to commit. "I put that in the folder marked things that require action," she said. "And where does it go from here?" "I think," she said, "that if it is real, if it is what you say it is and not kindness wearing a different coat, then it will still be real in the morning." "It will be," I said. "Then let's see," she said, and picked up the letter she had been holding, and the conversation ended, not with a door closing but with one left open, and I walked back to the study and sat for a long time doing nothing, and it was the most settled I had felt in 8 years. The morning came. I went to the kitchen garden path at the usual hour, and she was there, as she was most mornings, and we walked together this time, not because either of us had arranged it, but because it was the obvious thing to do, and we talked about the beechwood, and whether the path through it was safe after the recent rains, and we did not say anything of particular consequence, and it was the best conversation I could remember having. My grandmother was at breakfast before either of us. She was reading a letter and eating toast, and wore an expression of towering innocence. "Good morning, Edmund," she said without looking up. "Good morning, Coroner." "Good morning, ma'am," Coroner said, and went to see about the tea. My grandmother looked at me over her letter. Her eyes were, at 81, still very sharp. "Well," she said. "You arranged the library Wednesday," I said. "I arranged nothing," she said. "It rained." "You knew about the roof." "I know everything about this house," she said, exactly as she had before. "I have been coming here for 53 years. I sat down. She handed me the toast rack. "She is going to take some persuading," I said. "She has been disappointed before. She does not trust easily." "I know," my grandmother said. "She is very like you in that respect. It is one of the reasons I chose her." I looked at her. "You might have told me what you were doing." "If I had told you what I was doing," she said, with impeccable logic. You would have decided it before you had the chance to discover it yourself. You have been deciding things before you discover them for years, Edmund. It has been a significant problem. She picked up her letter. Toast. I ate the toast. Across the room, Corina was speaking to the housekeeper about something, turning slightly to make a point, and the morning light was on her profile, and I thought about what she had said the night before, that she would know it was real if it was still real in the morning, and I thought, yes. Yes, quite clearly yes. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. I want to be honest about this, because I think the stories we tell about love are sometimes dishonest in this particular way. They suggest that the significant things are always large, always visible, always audible across a crowded room. What happened between Corina Vale and me that August was none of those things. It was small and repeated and cumulative, which is, I have since come to understand, the only way the real kind works. We walked in the mornings. We argued with great pleasure about the Chalk Downland book and whether the medicinal uses it described were plausible or wishful thinking, and I sent to London for 3 more volumes on the subject, so that the argument could be properly conducted. She reorganized my grandmother's East sitting room filing system into something that could be understood by human beings, and then spent 2 afternoons teaching me the logic of it, because she said it was impractical to have a system that only one person could navigate. And I thought, as she explained it, that she was the most practically minded person I had ever met, and that this was, in some way I could not immediately articulate, an intensely attractive quality. She met my estate manager, Hawthorne, and within 20 minutes had identified a discrepancy in the drainage reports that Hawthorne had been puzzling over for a fortnight. And Hawthorne, who was 63 years old, had worked for my father, and was profoundly skeptical of most things, said to me afterwards, "That's a sharp mind, Your Grace," in a tone that suggested he considered it a statement of high praise. She read aloud to my grandmother in the evenings, and my grandmother, who was difficult about reading aloud, she had strong opinions about pace and emphasis that she was willing to communicate at length, did not once correct her. I noted this. It meant something. And Nicholas, she returned to Nicholas, carefully in the way that someone returns to a subject they believe requires more light rather than less. She did not excavate, she did not require me to produce feeling on schedule, she simply asked questions sometimes when the moment seemed to allow it. What had he been like at 10? What had made him decide on the sea? Whether I had kept the letters. I had kept the letters. I had never told anyone that I had kept them. I told her. "You should read them again," she said. "When you're ready, not to grieve, you've done enough of that, just to remember him alive." "I'm not certain I know the difference," I said. "I think you're getting closer to it," she said, and that was all, and it was enough. I did not say anything that could be called a declaration for a considerable time. This was not strategic. I was not calculating distance or timing with the cold arithmetic I applied to estate management. It was simply that every morning the thing was real, as she had said it would be, and I did not want to reduce it to a proposal before she had fully come to trust that it would not turn into something else at close range. She came to me first, in the end. Or rather, she came to my grandmother, and my grandmother, with the subtlety of a woman who had perfected the art of knowing when to disappear, found a reason to be elsewhere, and Corina found me in the library, the leaking roof library, as I had come to think of it, on a Thursday afternoon in mid-September. She stood in the doorway and she said, without preamble, "I need to tell you something." "Sit down," I said. "I won't. I need to stand for this." She looked at me directly. "I am leaving next week. Your grandmother's London cousin is coming to stay, and she requires more attendance than I can provide from here, and your grandmother has arranged for me to go to London to prepare the Ashford house for the visit." She paused. "I think she arranged this on purpose. I think she is giving us, a reason to say something that needs to be said before I go, rather than have it suspended indefinitely, which she knows we would both allow." "She is almost certainly doing that," I said. I know, she said. I also know that I have been not performing exactly but waiting. Waiting to see whether it would still be real at the end of a season. And it is. It has been real every morning and every walk and every dinner and every argument about botany, and she stopped. The word she had been about to use cost her something, I could see that. She used it anyway. I am afraid, she said. I have been a companion for 4 years, and before that I was a rector's daughter who had one very significant hope that came to nothing. And I have spent 4 years becoming someone who does not require things, because it is far easier to be reliable if you do not require things, and I am afraid that requiring this will. She stopped again. Will what? I said very quietly. Will be the wrong bet, she said, at the last moment. I stood up, I crossed the room. I stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to look at me, and I said, I have refused every woman my grandmother presented to me for 3 years. Some of them were brilliant. Some of them were accomplished. One of them was right about the corn laws. She looked at me. I refused them, I said, because sitting beside them was simply sitting beside someone. It produced no particular feeling and no particular wish. And then you redirected a dinner table conversation to spare me a moment's pain, and you asked me about Nicholas as though he had been a real person and not a careful grief, and you told me the truth about what hope costs you rather than asking me to manage it, and I have been aware of you every morning for 4 months in a way that I was not aware of myself previously. I held her gaze. I am not being kind. I am not performing. I am telling you as specifically and as clearly as I can manage that you are the particular person I want, not a companion, not a convenient candidate. You. She was very still. Corina, I said, will you? Yes, she said before I finished. I stopped. You haven't finished asking, I said. You were going to ask me to marry you, she said. I was. Then yes, she said. I know what I'm saying yes to. I wanted to say it before you finished in case I lost my nerve. The thing that was almost a smile appeared. I have waited a very long time to say yes to something of this kind. I would rather have said it too early than too late. I took her hands. They were steady, she was steady, as she had been in everything, but her fingers, when they closed around mine, held on. You will have to tell your grandmother, she said. She knows, I said. She cannot possibly know yet. She has known since June, I said, possibly earlier. Corina looked at me for a moment, then she looked at the ceiling. Then she laughed, a genuine laugh, not the performance of one. A laugh that had surprise in it and warmth and a quality of relief that I recognized because I felt it too, spreading through me like the first light in a kitchen garden on a morning when everything is still possible. Extraordinary woman, she said. Monstrous, I agreed. We owe her everything. We told my grandmother that evening in the west sitting room over tea. She received the news with an expression of complete astonishment that was so perfectly performed it was almost admirable. She said, "Well, I am very surprised," in a tone that suggested the opposite of every syllable. Then she patted Corina's hand and said, "I knew the moment you refiled the Milverton correspondence," which made no sense as a statement about love, but which was, I thought, as close as she would come to admitting what she had done. "You might have told me," I said for the second time. "Edmund," she said, "if you had needed to be told, it would not have worked." She picked up her embroidery. "Have some cake." We married in November in the church at Ashford Village, which is a small stone church with very old windows and a font that has been there since the 15th century. It was not a grand London wedding. We did not want a grand London wedding. There was my grandmother and Hawthorne and the estate household, and a Gloucestershire rector, Corina's father, gray-haired and quietly proud, who came on the train and shook my hand with both of his and said, "Take care of her," and I told him I intended to. I read Nicholas's letters that winter. Corina sat with me. not because I asked her to, but because she had understood before I had that it was time, and she simply brought her book and her lamp to the study where I was and stayed. I read them in order, from the first, breathless, overexcited, written from Portsmouth in the morning he sailed, to the last, which was dated 5 weeks before the Margrave went down, and was full of a young man's pleasure in a world that was large and new, and had not yet run out of things to show him. When I finished, I sat for a long while in the quiet. "He would have liked you," I said eventually. "Tell me something he did," she said. "Not something he was, something he did." I thought. "He wrote a letter to our cook," I said, "from Malta. It was 6 pages long. It was entirely about food he had eaten in a market, and whether the spice combinations she used in her Christmas pudding might be improved by the addition of something he had tasted there. She still has it. She gets it out every December." Coroner looked at me with the quiet gray eyes that I had been looking at for 6 months and would look at for the rest of my life, and she said, "He sounds like someone who paid attention to the people everyone else walked past." "He was," I said. "Then I know where you learned to do it," she said, "even if you were out of practice." I had not known until she said it that I had learned it from him. But I thought about it, sitting there with the letters in my lap and the lamp burning low, and I thought she was right, that Nicholas had always looked at the people at the edges of the room with the same complete attention he gave to everything else, and that somewhere in my long years of severity I had lost that, and that what I had been doing since June was finding it again. She had been the one who made it possible to find. My grandmother lived for 3 more years, which I think she managed by sheer force of will and the profound satisfaction of being right about something important. She died at 84 in the room she preferred at Ashford in the early morning, with the sound of the garden coming through the window and Corona at her hand, and I think she was content. What she left behind among her papers, sorted impeccably and cross-referenced according to her own system, which Corona had mastered so completely that she could navigate it without notes, was a single letter unsealed addressed to me in her familiar script. It was not long. It said, "Edmund, I arranged the furniture, you arranged the rest. She was always the right one. I simply needed you to look. Your grandmother who was right as usual." I have it in the folder she would have called "Things that are finished." She was not wrong about any of it. Corona brought me tea this morning, which she does not do every morning but does when she has noticed I have been up since before dawn reviewing ledgers, which I have been. She set the cup on the desk and she did not say anything, because she has learned, as I have learned over the years, that we do not always need to say things, and she went to sit in the chair by the window with her book, which is a chalk downland flora volume, a new one, with considerably more scientific rigor than my grandfather's original. The morning light came through the window and caught in her hair. I thought about my grandmother, and about Nicholas, and about the dinner in June when Corona redirected a conversation with one perfectly timed question, and I thought about how close I had come to missing all of it, to being the kind of man who makes a sensible marriage and considers the whole matter settled, who keeps the grief in its proper compartment and never sits in a leaking roof library while the rain comes down, and finds out what it is to be truly known by someone. I did not miss it. She did not let me. I looked up from the ledger. She was reading or appearing to read. There was the edge of that expression on her face, the one that comes before a smile decides to commit. "You are watching me," she said without looking up. "I am," I said. "Is there a reason?" "Several," I said, "none that require explaining." She turned a page. "Your tea is getting cold," she said. I drank the tea. Outside, the kitchen garden was gray and gold in the September light, and somewhere in the beechwood there was a sound, wind, or a bird, and the house was full of the particular deep quiet that old houses hold, and I thought, this is exactly what my grandmother intended. She was, as usual, right.